Development of the newspaper in America. The modern newspaper is a European invention. The oldest direct ancestor of the modern newspaper appears to have been the handwritten news sheets that circulated widely in the 16th century in Venice, which was a center for trade and therefore for information. With very few exceptions, the early newspapers never reported any news about the country in which they were printed. Print shops were tightly regulated. Europe's rulers allowed them to print newspaper as long as these papers did not discuss any local or national issues or events. Britain's American colonies entered the world of the newspaper relatively late. It was not until 1690 did the first American news sheet, Boston Public Occurrences, published by Benjamin Harris, make its debut. The Massachusetts authorities, in high resentment that Harris dared to report that English military forces had allied themselves with miserable savages, put him out of business 4 days later. And the first issue of America's first newspaper was also the last. The Boston Newsletter, America's second printed newspaper, published 14 years later, was a much tamer affair than Harris's newspaper. In the following years, newspapers appeared successively in almost every colony. By 1765, all but 2 of the colonies, Delaware and New Jersey, had weekly newspapers. These early papers were careful not to offend colonial authorities and were filled primarily with short news items, documents, and essays mostly taken from other newspapers, particularly British and European papers. The major limitation on press freedom was the stamp passed by the British Parliament in 1765, which had the effect of raising the price of newspapers to the point where the poorer classes could not afford to buy them. Americans were not represented in this parliament, and American newspapers rebelled against the new tax. Similar protests reverberated through the colonial newspapers when the British Parliament approved the Townshend Acts in 1767, which imposed taxes on American imports of glass, lead, paint, tea, and significantly paper. Though not all the colonial newspapers were on the anti-British side. Most American newspapers, in the years leading up to the American Revolution, represented something the world had never before seen: a bolder press committed to challenging, even overthrowing, governmental authorities. These newspapers were, in a sense, loyal to the new authorities who had appeared on the continent. The Sons of Liberty. During the Revolution, these newspapers were also an effective force working towards the unification of sentiment, the awakening of a consciousness with a common purpose, interest, and destiny among the separate colonies, and of a determination to see the war through to a successful issue. They were more single-minded than the people themselves, and bore no small share of the burden of arousing and supporting the often discouraged and indifferent public spirit. In the unsettled years after the Revolution, American newspapers remained filled with arguments and anger, now directed not against the British, but against their political opponents. Each of the 2 parties that formed, the Federalists and the Republicans, had their newspapers, and these papers had little sympathy for representatives of the other side. Federalist Party leaders, increasingly uncomfortable with the criticism they were taking from the Republican editors, signed the Sedition Act in 1798 to protect the government from the libels of editors. The result was a dozen convictions and a storm of outraged public opinions that threw the party from power, and led the Republicans to take control of the government in the 1800s. The experiment with a free press then continued, with the press in the United States eventually demonstrating a compatibility with the maintenance of orderly government. Newspapers became a form of public property after 1800, freely available in reading rooms, barbershops, taverns, hotels, and coffee houses. The editor, usually reflecting the sentiment of a group or a faction, began to emerge as a distinct power, closely following the drift of events and expressing vigorous opinions. The years of violence also witnessed a development in both the quality and the power of newspapers. News reporting was extended to the fields of local affairs, and the intense rivalry from numerous competitors initiate the rush for the earliest reports, which was to become the dominant trait in American journalism.